Welcome back to the Purple Political Breakdown. How's it going? How's your day been? Today's episode, we have an excellent guest to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. He has a lot of history with the conflict. He's also going to endorse his book, but this should be a good conversation, and maybe we can come up with a realistic, or at the very least, dive into the intricacies of this conflict to a level that a lot of people haven't heard from. With that said, as always, we advocate for political solutions without political bias. We try to have conversation, discussion, civil discourse, maybe even debates, regardless of what side you're on, and try to get to the meat and potatoes of the matter. As always, we also provide and always try to make sure that you guys are getting the most factual and the most unbiased information possible. I'll let you know what my opinions are, but the facts are the facts and they should not be discounted. One way we do that is through our feature, US Resist News, a nonprofit news service dedicated to truthful reporting in an age of disinformation. Learn more about it at www.usresistnews.org, where you can find my podcast or you can subscribe to their newsletter to get information in your email every single day. Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. It should be a good one. Like and subscribe on the YouTube channel, rate it 5 stars on the podcast, and let's dive right into it. So here's my guest for today's podcast episode. I'm gonna allow him to introduce himself, endorse his book, and really talk about where he comes from when it comes to this Israel-Palestine conflict, and then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation for today's episode. Go ahead.
Nice to be with you, Raydell. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Can you start off introducing yourself, what your name is, and how are you involved in this conflict?
Sure, Raydell. My name is Mark Patinkin. I'm a longtime journalist based on the East Coast and Rhode Island in particular, but I've been a journalist and columnist for, feels like since the Franklin Roosevelt administration, forever. And I've done a lot of international reporting, ranging from doing some work in Ethiopia back in the 1980s during a famine there. Actually, I went all the way across Africa. In 1989, I spent a month covering the collapse of Eastern European communism, including the fall of the Berlin Wall. I managed to get myself arrested by the Romanian secret police at that point when they were kind of like North Korea. And I've also spent a number of times covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including in 1991 when I was there inside Gaza during the Intifada. And most recently, I decided to go witness the current war. And the result of that, after spending a month or so in Israel with the West Bank and Gaza, trying to cover all sides equally, I published a recent book. Sorry about the backward lettering, but it's called The Holy Land at War. And that's now available on Amazon. Though it was a fight, Amazon at first banned the book, even though it's a very even-handed account. I think probably just they're gun shy of a controversial subject. And even recently, I tried to put some ads on Amazon for the book, and they refused the ads because of, quote, current events. I guess that's their way of saying they're scared of a controversial issue, even though the book is on Amazon and available there. But it's been a big mountain to climb to do the book, and I've left kind of with hope for an eventual solution, but I know that at the moment that long-term solution has been set back by the war and what I've heard from both Palestinians and Jews during my time in Israel in that area.
All right. It definitely seems you're very much involved. You have a long history regarding this conflict. And it's unfortunate when you try to get out information and you're kind of like blockaded to an extent because of a unwillingness to allow controversial content such as Amazon. But you can see his book. You can get his book. The link will be in my description on the podcast, of course, so you guys can go check it out, of course. Anything else you want to say about the book before we kind of get into the conversation?
Yeah, just that, I'll tell you how it began, Raydell. Riddell. It's when October 7th first happened, I wrote a number of commentaries, armchair commentaries from here in the States about the issue, and and there was a lot of controversy around that because whatever side you take, as we see every day from the campuses in America to the tweets on X or Twitter, people are very divided on this issue. And I felt that instead of being one more armchair commentator, it was my role as an old school journalist to go. And so I went, and the angle of the book is really I just went as a witness. It's not a political analysis. It basically is like sitting down with someone over a cup of coffee or a beer and them saying, what's it really like over there? And that's how I wrote the book. I wrote the book just explaining what I ran into, what I saw, and what I heard and what I felt. It's a personal journey through a war zone that has upended the world.
I definitely appreciate that perspective. It's always hard to contextualize like conflicts like this. I've said this constantly on my platform and to people in general, to expect that people, especially from an outside point of view, to really understand the conflict and its nuances behind these like blanket rhetoric that comes from both the left and the right is not a truly indicative on what is going on. I mean, you would really have to not only be there, but also understand the history of the conflict as well to see how events kind of unfolded. In today's episode, I am curious to have your perspective in this conversation. And I kind of want to go through kind of three layers to kind of eventually get to modern history and the modern situation between Israel and Palestine. One of the three pillars of the conversation that I believe happens all the time is how it started, the origination of the conflict, who has rights to the land, and I put quotes for a reason, and why this kind of created what caused the conflict between the Palestinians who were there and the Jewish people who came there later on. What is your perspective on how it started?
Well, I like to answer these questions from my experience there rather than just being one more person repeating historical narrative. And uh, so let me just, in terms of how it started, well, I was in the old city of Jerusalem and went right up to the Western Wall, the holiest spot for Jews in this world. It's the retaining wall of the first temple built by Solomon, son of David, 3,000 years ago. And when you look up at the very top of the wall, as complicated as this conflict is, you also see how simple it is. The very top of the most sacred spot in Judaism, you see one of the most sacred spots in Islam, and that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome where Muhammad ascended to heaven, right on top of the wall. And only steps away is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus died and rose, all within this 1 acre. The passions of half the earth play out, and I think it's where the world has seen the greatest number of battles. The battles over Jerusalem, there's no other place on earth that has seen as many. It's been conquered 50 times, and there's been 100 battles over it. In a way, this is one more battle. And so, the Jews there go back to the Bible. I was on the West Bank at one point in a Jewish settlement right in a town called Shiloh, where they showed me archaeological evidence of where Joshua, who was almost back in the time of Moses, brought the Ark of the Covenant, that thing in Indiana Jones. And so the Jews claim that even on the West Bank, it predates Jerusalem, and they feel that, their indigenous roots there are very pronounced. But you also, as I went to both inside Gaza and in the West Bank itself, Palestinians have been there and established themselves for a very long time too. And their claim is that after the War of 1948, right after Israel was created by the United Nations, half Israel, half Palestine, and Israel accepted it, the Jews accepted it, the Palestinians rejected it, and there was a war over it. And Palestinians will say it was at that point that many of them were pushed out of their homeland, their homes in what is now Israel proper. There's a big debate about whether or not many of them left voluntarily at the behest of the other Arab countries that invaded and told them to clear the area so they could wipe out the Jews. But many of them did leave for that reason. But many of them were pushed out in the war and by Jewish Jewish concerns, though many stayed, and there's now 2 million Arab Israelis right in Israel itself with equal rights. But it stems from Israel being there in ancient times, Israel being created in 1948, and now there being two Palestinian territories, Gaza to Israel's west and the West Bank to its east. It's called the West Bank because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. And those two territories are where 4 million Palestinians live, and they still yearn for self-determination. And really, this is still a battle over Jerusalem.
Now I want to ask a follow-up question, but when we talk about modern history, I'll ask that question a little bit later because it involves Jerusalem and something that has happened a couple years ago that may or may not play into this conflict. So I'm curious.
Sure, go ahead and ask. We could just let it flow.
Oh, we'll get to that one. We'll get to that one. I want to go through the historical timeline of events a little bit. I do appreciate your perspective on this, especially when you kind of outlined tangible locations that played into a belief that they have claim to the land for both Palestine and Israel, of course. And even like when it comes to the Jewish people in Israel, they said they had claims thousands of years ago. And of course, Palestine was there, not officially claiming the land, but they were located there. I forget at the end of which conflict, but I believe it was at the, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm at any point wrong, of course. But the Ottoman Empire, of course, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Palestinians were there. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of claims both ways, but I think the beginning of the Palestinian population began to filter in around the time after the Ottoman Empire when it became a British protectorate, more or less.
Right.
And many the Palestinians' roots really are people from surrounding countries like Egypt and Syria that came in as laborers and also as just new homesteaders and immigrants in the early part of the 1900s, in particular, while Britain was in charge, and they began to develop roots there and an identity there.
Exactly. And I appreciate that clarification. So ultimately, when we recognize this and you really understand the history, you understand that both of them have a weird type of claim to the land. None of it's official, but all of them have something that they are intricately tied to, culturally and religiously tied to when it comes to this. That's why it's such a complicated scenario. What do you think about the people who make the claims that, especially from the Israel side, because that's where I hear it from most. The Jewish people who came to the land afterwards came over here and just took it over like the British did to so many countries. What do you believe? What do you think about that claim that is constantly made?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is that it was there have been Jews there since the inception, even though when Rome destroyed the Second Temple back after the time of Jesus, and the 10 tribes of Israel were dispersed around the world. There were still Jews there ever since way back then. However, yes, in 1948, when Israel was created, the history shows us that part of its creation was in a response to the Holocaust. It was a response to Jews needing a place to go in this world. And many of the few Jews that survived the Holocaust that were still in Auschwitz and alive afterwards, many of them went back to their villages in Poland. Some of them were even tragically killed by Polish neighbors who had taken over their homes. And there are stories of Jews that survived Auschwitz, went back home, and they were thrown out, and they went back and just were sitting there in Auschwitz, not sure where there was a place for them anywhere in the world. And representatives from Israel, Jews from Israel, came to Poland and said, we're building a homeland there for Jews. And so many of them did come from Europe after World War II as a homeland. And after the creation of Israel in 1948, a lot of the Arab states during that war, turned on their Jewish populations. There used to be hundreds of thousands. There used to be almost 1 million Jews in places like Syria and Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Morocco, you name it. And they were all driven out. They were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and 49. And again, they had nowhere to go in the world but Israel. And so there was a confluence of Jews that had no other place on this earth after centuries, well, after 5 years of war, but also really centuries of persecution. Jews finally had a home. Now, yes, many of them came in. They will claim, and I think that's totally legitimate, that many of them bought land from Arabs that were there or took over land that was not officially owned. But yes, there were absolutely cases where Arabs felt driven out, especially during the war. The war was really of 1948, the War of Israel's creation was really where most of this happened. The Jews did say, we accept Palestine next to us. Palestine rejected it. And as part of the war, I even talked with some Palestinians who I've been, when I was over there. I remember a woman I was speaking to in Gaza. I said, how did you end up in Gaza? She said, well, I was in Israel, and my father told me that during the War of 1948, Jews came in and pushed him out of his village, and we ended up here in Gaza. And so events like that happen, but it's a mix. Palestinians will say the Jews pushed all of us out of Israel and took our land. It's not like that. It was a war where there were many people that were refugees. It was also a time when many Jews bought the land from Palestinians, and Jews had also homesteaded the land for millennia.
Yeah, it's also quite I think surprising, especially when British left officially, and after the British left, all these Arab countries, including Palestine, went up against Israel. And I guess the surprising part is the fact that Israel technically won the conflict despite everything. And obviously, we saw what happened. The establishment of an Israeli state obviously happened. Conflict didn't obviously go down, but there was a lot of peace that was eventually happening between Israel as time goes by. Israel and some of these other countries, where Israel created a peace deal with Egypt and eventually created a peace deal with Jordan. And I'm curious on your thoughts about throughout the time, despite the initial conflict and how the perceptions of Jews was from the Arab countries, to time going by and more of these other Arab countries, not Palestine, but these Arab countries started recognizing Israel and creating these peace deals. What do you think that did towards the kind of Palestinian identity and Palestinian movement throughout that time?
Well, I will say this, that I remember being in, again, I like to answer your questions from my own experience rather than just analysis or taking a chapter from a book. I remember being in Gaza. I was one of the only Western faces in Gaza back in the 1990s during the Intifada, and I stayed in one of the only really rooming houses. It was like an old inn there, and there was a woman that ran the inn and was delighted to have me as a guest because there were very few, and this was again while Israel was occupying Gaza, and I asked her what she felt. She showed me the inn's little registry where guests would sign, and all the representatives of Arab countries would come often and stay at that inn, and their names were there. And I said, well, that's great that the Arab country reps are coming to try to stand with the Palestinians here in Gaza. And she kind of smirked and said, they don't care. None of the other Arab countries care about us Palestinians. They don't care about us. We're alone in the world. And I heard that from others too inside Gaza, and even some inside the West Bank. So there's a feeling that even though many Arab countries are standing up for the Palestinians now, and certainly Hezbollah had started a war in solidarity with the Palestinians on Israel's northern border, which turned out to be a disaster for Hezbollah in the last month. The Palestinians have often felt alone, even in the eyes of their Arab neighbors. And as I'm sure you know, Riddell, Gaza's border with Israel is not its only border. They have a border with Egypt too, and that border is even more secure than Israel's border. And Egypt doesn't let any Palestinians in. So right. I think the Palestinians have watched. You're right. They watched the peace with Egypt. They watched the peace with Jordan, and though I don't think I'm not sure they probably have felt a little bit abandoned in some respects. Even though there are still many Arab countries, including Iran and factions like Hezbollah that stand with the Palestinians, but they feel a little bit abandoned by other Arab countries. And yet I will say this, and let me again share some experience I had both when I was in Gaza and when I went to the West Bank. There was one day I went to the West Bank because as a journalist, I wanted to see both sides. I mean, I went everywhere, man. I went inside the war zone. I went to the worst hit kibbutz on October 7th, a devastating day to see the carnage there. They hadn't changed a thing. And then I went to the West Bank. Israelis told me, don't go on the Palestinian bus. That could be dangerous. But I wanted to. I wanted to experience it authentically. It wasn't dangerous to me. Palestinians were very welcoming. And I went to a refugee camp at one point and went inside a home to where I was welcomed. I never heard the word welcome so much. The Palestinian culture is very welcoming, very hospitable. And yet there is something I did notice about the Palestinian culture, which I need to say honestly. They pointed while they were serving me lunch and being very welcoming, 20, 30 people in a room. It was a big deal. An American journalist was there. But it was also so they could spread their message. They kept asking me, why is your government giving bombs to Israel to kill babies in Gaza, is how they kept asking. But they were also very welcoming. But they pointed to their patriarch on the wall, who had just died in his 90s, and they said he had land near Tel Aviv, and our whole goal is to get back to that land. When I was in Gaza, I talked to kids who said, our grandfather used to live in Israel. Our whole goal is to get back to that land. To be honest, there's not going to ever be a solution where Palestinians are able to return to the land that's part of Tel Aviv or a part of much of Israel. And there is a tendency in Palestinian culture, I must say, even though I love the culture of very welcoming, they tend to look backwards to try to reclaim an impossible past instead of looking forward to build on what they have. And I think that is a challenge in the Palestinian yearning and their dream, because they are so focused on trying to reclaim the past that they don't put as much effort as they should in building a future. And Gaza is a perfect example. Israel left in 2005. Nobody was there. No Israeli soldiers, no Jews. This was really an example, as of 2005, of a Palestinian territory. It was all Palestinian. And instead of, they built it up somewhat. It had some very nice areas, but instead of just continuing to develop it into a potential kind of Singapore with a beautiful Mediterranean waterfront, they poured billions of dollars into tunnels and in Hamas's jihadist dream of attacking Israel to reclaim this impossible past instead of building on what they had.
I think that's such an interesting point that you brought, because I also agree that this idea that Palestine believes, and we saw throughout history with like them saying I think it was called like the three ends or something like that, where they said they won't recognize a Jewish state, they won't recognize the Israeli culture, stuff like that. And that was a constant sentiment, that this idea that they can take back Israel, and it never manifested, of course, as we've seen. And that kind of touches upon something that I want to talk about regarding the Oslo Accords. But before we get there, a kind of important movement happened before the Oslo Accords, and that was the Intifada. Can you speak on your kind of perspective from the Intifada and what that did for not only Palestine, but changing the perception for Israel as well?
Sure. I was there during the Intifada. In fact, I did a patrol with an Israeli Jeep inside Gaza itself in 1991. And man, that Jeep must have been hit by hundreds of stones thrown by kids. And to show how early kids sometimes are inculcated into this culture of hatred against Israel, check this out, Riddell. This is a photo I took right here from the back of the Israeli Jeep. This is a child throwing a stone at us. I took that photo in 1991, maybe 4 years old, and they were all part of throwing stones. I went on that trip, by the way, through Gaza. This was during the Intifada. With this is 1991. This is a Jeep commander named Oded Turban, and part of that's him in Gaza when we paused on the Jeep patrol. And as part of this book, 30 years later, I tracked him down. And here he is today at age 65 or so, same guy. And so I was, looking for a then and now perspective. And I will say, when I was in that Jeep, Oded often told me, we shouldn't be occupiers because it's making our young soldiers into, it's dragging them down a dark hole because they're so hated. We're hated when we drive through uh, Gaza. Though he did also say, and I heard the same thing, that people will whisper to them. They didn't dare say it out loud that they didn't like the jihadists, the extremists. And back then, there was the beginning of Hamas. But the Intifada, as many people know, is basically a call for an uprising. It just began kind of organically inside Gaza when actually there was a Israeli vehicle that hit some Palestinians. It was an accident, but word went around that it was intentional, and there were some riots there. And then they spread to the West Bank, and then there was a call by extremists that there should be constant protests and even violence against Israelis to be able to drive home their call for a Palestinian state, and that included thousands of people being killed on both sides, including bombs placed on civilian buses in Tel Aviv. It was a very difficult 5 or 6 year period. That was in the early 1990s, and then there was another intifada around the year 2000. And those intifadas, I think, led to. I don't think those had good results. They led to just a rise in some Israeli extremism and a securing of the borders of the West Bank and Gaza even more because of the threat of infiltration by terrorists. I don't think the intifadas accomplished a lot, and they were very focused on terrorism against civilians. And so when you hear on U.S. campuses kids on Ivy League rallies saying, let's globalize the intifada and things like that, it makes you wonder how smart the kids are in Harvard because they just are repeating slogans without understanding history.
I agree. A lot of college students say some crazy things. Ultimately, I think they look at the Intifada in terms of the result being the Oslo Accords, not really take into account what they were doing, of course, on the ground and how much death and how much violence actually happened. Now, the results, of course, Israel felt kind of like, hey, we need to stop this. Let's create a deal. And I think the Oslo Accords, from my understanding, is like probably the biggest agreement between both sides to try to establish some semblance of peace. And in that situation, the sentiment was there. Palestine actually agreed. They were trying to create a Palestinian state, but for some reason it didn't work out. Why do you think it did not work out as intended? I have my own theory, but I'm curious on your perspective on why you think it didn't kind of.
Yeah, it's very complicated, Riddell. Very complicated, but we have to state the truth, and the truth is that there have been some excellent and again, my heart goes to the Palestinian culture, Palestinian people. I found them very welcoming, but I think historically they have rejected some very good deals. There was a very good deal that was offered to Arafat when he was in charge of the Palestinian PLO at that point, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is a precursor to the Palestinian Authority and really still there. And, he was basically given a deal with 95% of the West Bank. And the other 5% he could have gotten too because they were going to swap some villages right on the border. And he rejected that because of two reasons. One is that he felt he wanted more of Israel back. And also he was afraid of the true extremists who, Hamas will kill you if you make even a good deal like that, or the Hamas-like folks back in the 1990s. And I think it also fell apart a little bit on the Israeli side because part of the Oslo Accords were agreed to by Yitzhak Rabin, who was a liberal Israeli, more of a leftist Israeli leader. Clinton was part of that, and then there's some dangers on the Israeli side too. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an extremist Jew in Israel for making peace with the Palestinians. So that tragedy of losing Yitzhak Rabin is one reason the Oslo Accords unraveled. After he was killed, the government in Israel tilted a little bit more to the right, and there was some ongoing terrorism as well. And it was a casualty of all of those factors that some of the agreements in the Oslo Accords never went through. Those factors basically being Palestinian resistance to embracing a good deal because they wanted everything, and also Israel swinging a little bit to the right and pushing away from the deal because, well, Israel wants, there are forces in Israel that want to take more and more of the West Bank.
So I'm glad you said you mentioned the two extremes because for the most part we agree. I think to put it very generally on my perspective when I was reading up on this stuff, one thing that I noted is the extremes on both sides heavily affected the Oslo Accords. It was a problem, and it also kind of made me think of like current U.S. culture in how the extremes of the right and the left are truly affecting current politics too, and how problematic not truly condemning, not just saying, "Oh yeah, they're bad," but like completely separating them from the state, completely separating them from the government, making them a different entity altogether would kind of be a better way to go about kind of these negotiations. And it can be easier said than done, of course, especially if a large population of the country is advocating for something like a greater Israel movement, for example. But with that said, I do think that the at times with stuff like this, extremes of both sides can be in the way of negotiating true peace. And from what I saw from this conflict, both the extremes of Hamas and the extremes of the extreme Israeli right wing was a big part of kind of preventing that Oslo Accords to going how it was probably intended to in the first place. So, do you generally agree with that, or what do you think?
You have the extremist elements on both sides, and maybe that's been forever the case, that there are extremist elements on both sides. And I can't deny that the Israeli right-wing government with Netanyahu now has some extremist tendencies. And but the Palestinians, look, they've never had, if you remember going back this far, Riddell, they've never had an Anwar Sadat, who was the famous president of Egypt who made peace with Israel and
Right.
really known as a great statesman. I have to say that there has never been leadership of the Palestinian people that really took an inspirational approach with embracing peace. There was always kind of an extremist element there, um, and that has really been exacerbated, or that has really gone to an extreme with Hamas taking over Gaza. They are jihadists and they just want the destruction of Israel. And so there's no hope for peace with Hamas. Now, there may be hope with the Palestinian Authority, which is running the West Bank. They are a more moderate. And as many people may have forgotten, at one point the Palestinian Authority also ran Gaza, and then Israel left in 2005. There were elections in 2006, and Hamas won half that election. So it was a coalition government between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority back then. And one reason Hamas won wasn't just that people loved their jihadist philosophy, but I got to say the Palestinian Authority is very corrupt, and still is, and has been somewhat misguided leadership. And what happened then in 2007 is Hamas began to do unpleasant things like throwing Palestinian Authority leaders off of roofs. That led to an actual Palestinian civil war, man, in Gaza between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And Hamas, hundreds were killed in this Palestinian civil war. Hamas won. They drove the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza. Now there's two separate Palestinian governments, one in Gaza led by jihadists, one in the West Bank, which is really going to be the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations because that's the center of Palestinian population culture. And they still run the West Bank. They are kind of not up there. As I said, there's some corruption there and some mismanagement. But if there's any hope for the future, it will be for Hamas to be degraded and pushed out of power, and for the Palestinian Authority to come back into Gaza as the standing government, hopefully with the backing of Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, who will hopefully, and Qatar, perhaps, whose money could help rebuild Gaza and give enough power to the Palestinian Authority for their security forces to be able to hold on to Gaza without Hamas trying to rise up again and take back over. Because there's no future There's no future with Hamas in power. They're jihadists.
The Palestinian Authority is a very interesting variable towards a permanent solution. And then I want to bring that back up a little bit later. But ultimately, I think people can start understanding and seeing that this conflict started, its origins was very complicated, of course. Conflict happened, Israel won. And then eventually we got to the point where Palestine eventually became their own individual entity. But because of those elements of extremism that still wanted more than they can bargain for, to be honest, and trying to take back all of Israel, it made it hard for Israel in general to truly accept a proper solution with them, especially when you have an extreme right version of Israel that either one wants Israel to be larger than expected with the greater Israel movement, or two has somewhat realistic claims that because of that organization of terrorism that exists at our borders, we can't allow them to have more power. So it's a very complicated, ridiculous situation. And then we come into like modern history. Before we kind of go into like the conflict, you brought up something earlier with Jerusalem. So this is what I was going to ask. What do you think Donald Trump making Jerusalem the capital did with the tensions between Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, I think that issue is a little bit overblown, Riddell. It obviously was something the Palestinians resented because they want to claim Jerusalem as their capital too. And I'm not sure all the listeners know this, but most countries don't have their embassies in Jerusalem, even though that is the capital of Israel. And that's not Tel Aviv, it's Jerusalem. Many countries don't have their capital there because the Palestinians dispute it and say we want Jerusalem, at least a big part of Jerusalem, to be our capital too. And so a lot of countries don't want to take sides in that dispute. And as America was one of them, but Trump came in and said, what the heck? We're putting our capital where Israel's capital is. I mean, we're putting our embassy in Israel's capital. And that led to a lot of anger at the time. But I don't think that was overly I don't think that's led to long-standing problems. There's I think Paraguay recently put their capital also. I'm sorry, their embassy also in
MC.
Jerusalem. But it's less about where the embassy is, though. Trump took that leap, and more about the two counterclaims to Jerusalem, and that's, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, that's where the passions run deepest. Jerusalem is just so deep in the hearts of both Palestinians and Jews, and it's really more or less right now the Jewish capital. And look, it forever will be. It forever will be. But if you go into homes in Gaza, you'll see photos of families and sons and others standing in front of. I remember being in Gaza. I was in the home of a mom who had lost her son to an Israeli raid, actually, and there was a photo of the son standing in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And I said, I didn't know the Gazans were able to get to Jerusalem that easily. Many can, but not all. And she said, no, but there's popular photo services here where you could have this was back in the day before the internet, where you could have your photo standing in front of Jerusalem because that's deep in their hearts. But that's another area where, there could be some conversation in the future about East Jerusalem, a part of Jerusalem being a part of a Palestinian capital, because it already is very Palestinian. But it's just the Jews will never give up Jerusalem as the heart of their country and their culture and their identity.
So with that said, the current conflict regarding Israel and Palestine, as we know, it started after October 7th, a grotesque situation that I feel like for the most part, everybody agrees that was a terrible terrorist attack on a lot of innocent people. Coming down to time goes by, we're in a current conflict. There's a lot of discourse, and the kind of Palestinian support and Israel support is at all-time highs, and it's no clear kind of person that people are advocating for because of these differences. Of course, you could definitely say negatives on Gaza side, obviously October 7th, and negatives on Israel side that people bring up as well with, civilian deaths. What is your current perception of the current state of the conflict of Israel-Palestine?
Um, yeah, in other words, what happens with this war? As we all know, there's been a lot of changes with the collapse of the Syrian dictatorship just a week
Yeah.
ago or so. That has a huge impact, and there's also, it speaks of the unintended consequences of war and how things could lead to bad results if you start a war. And that's been the history of the world. Those who start wars often pay a price, and the price can be very high. The truth is, because of October 7th, Hamas started this war. And really, if you want to know the truth, Iran started the war because Iran was backing Hamas. And what did that lead to? There was hope that Hamas would I don't think they had any hope that they would win militarily, but they hoped to get the passions of the world or the sympathy of the world behind them. And in fact, that has to some extent happened as we see all these pro-Palestinian marches everywhere. But they thought it would lead to enough pressure on Israel from other forces, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, that would and Iran even doing some attacks on Israel, that would pressure Israel into making some kind of compromise and concession. But the opposite happened. Look what's happened. Hamas started this war. Hamas is now not completely destroyed, but mostly destroyed. What happened to Hezbollah, which is the state within a state that basically is a parasite on Lebanon? I've spent some time in Lebanon. I covered their civil war there in the late 1980s. I saw the rise of Hezbollah. I was almost kidnapped at one point by Hezbollah as one of the only Western faces on the Muslim side of Beirut back in the 1980s. And I saw that Hezbollah was taking over this beautiful country with the backing of Iran. And Hezbollah then began to attack Israel in solidarity with Hamas from the north. And what happened to them? Israel took it for a year and then launched an attack against Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been mostly destroyed now too. So Hamas started a war, they're mostly destroyed. Hezbollah joined the war, they're mostly destroyed. And what did that lead to? Hezbollah fighters used to help the dictator Bashar al-Assad in Syria hold on to power, and they were so depleted by the war in Israel that the dictator fell. It was a direct result of Israel attacking Hezbollah a month ago, led to the fall of Syria. And so, and that has also hurt Iran, because these were Iran-backed proxies. Iran backed Hamas. Iran backed Hezbollah. Iran backed the Syrian dictatorship, and all those have been severely degraded. And so the result of the war right now is suddenly changed, to answer your question. There was a time even 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, Israel, even though they were winning militarily, it seemed like they may have been losing the battle of public opinion, and there could be pressure brought to bear because of that. Now, because of the collapse of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Syrian dictatorship, things have shifted a little bit, and Israel seems like it's making headway in degrading its enemies. So what will happen from here? The big question is what will happen from here is, what I think is that Israel, even though a ceasefire would be humanitarian, I think if Israel can't stop until they've destroyed Hamas to a point where Hamas can't return to power. Because if they return to power, it'll happen again. And that's where things stand now. Israel feels they have to continue until Hamas is basically surrenders and can't come back to power.
Yeah, I agree. At this point, I also believe that Israel is going to completely do what needs to be done to take over Gaza and get rid of Hamas. Of course, all the ceasefire negotiations made saying that we won't make any ceasefire negotiations without all the hostages released. I mean, Hamas is not going to do that because that's their only leverage at this point. So with that said, Israel is going to take over and completely destroy Hamas at any means possible. I also believe that is the case. But you did say something before we kind of get into that and what that would mean for the future of Palestine. You said the course of public opinion has changed for Israel, And obviously, with everything you said with all these countries, Syria, Hezbollah, all that stuff, I also agree with. But what do you think about the current trial on Netanyahu that's taking place? Right now, there's a trial in Israel with Netanyahu, um, saying that he is, bribery, corruption, all that stuff that makes that you could think of for a terrible leader. What do you think about that trial? And do you think that's going to have huge ramifications for Israel as a whole?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I would even make kind of a rough analogy with prosecutions of Donald Trump. I think it'll be a distraction, but it won't derail Netanyahu. And again, I always like to answer these questions from my experience instead of just in the analyzing in my experience.
Right.
Riddell, is when I was over there, I did see some very virulent demonstrations against Netanyahu. Israel's a democracy, and there are such protests, and those protests have many folks that are family members of the hostages who just want their hostages back, so they want the war to end, and they hate Netanyahu. And but I will say this: I'll say two things. One is that I think that despite this trial, Netanyahu's stock has risen because of the events of the last month or so. Hezbollah half destroyed, and Syria now having fallen. But I'll also say this: I will say just about Netanyahu. I don't think the trial will sink him, but I know he's unpopular there. However, one thing that I learned in talking to people there is even people that don't like Netanyahu, even Israelis that are on the left, even Israelis that are peaceniks, and many of the people who were killed on October 7th were peaceniks. In fact, all of them were. All the Israelis that were attacked on October 7th lived next to Gaza because they believed in peace, and then they were the ones that were murdered. And so many of them will say about Netanyahu, I don't like him, but he's getting the job done, and the job has to be finished. And that's how they see Netanyahu.
All right, fair enough. With that said, as we were talking about, in terms of the current course of Israel, I believe that they will do whatever means to take out Gaza, take out Hamas, and especially with the understanding that all these Arab countries are surrounding them, they're really not going to step in. They want to end the conflict, but they're not going to go out their way at this point, it seems, to really help out Palestine, Gaza, and Hamas, especially, of course, being over there. Um, with that said, what do you think is going to happen to Palestine if Israel takes over, completely takes out Hamas, and now Gaza is at that point will be under Israel's control to see like, okay, what's the plan now?
Yeah, that's a good question. That brings up the question of what does peace look like, Riddell? What does peace look like? And
Right.
so Israel probably will be um, in there as occupiers, if you want to use that phrase, or peacekeepers, or if you want to use a more sympathetic phrase, post-war peacekeepers. But will Israel stay there forever? There are extremist elements in Israel that want to move military presence in there long term. I don't think that'll work myself. It didn't work before when I was there on that Jeep patrol and I saw that the occupier was hated and stoned by kids. And I think that will backfire on Israel. I think there are some things that Israel may insist on, such as having some kind of presence along the border with Egypt inside Gaza. Uh,
Right.
because that's where a lot of the arms got smuggled in. So Israel will feel they need to control arms coming back in through that other border. So there may be some kind of presence there. But I think if your question is what do things look like after the war is finally over, the ideal would simply be that, again, I think we talked about this, but to reiterate it, that Hamas is degraded to the point where they cannot come back to power, where Gaza becomes ruled by the more moderate Palestinian Authority with a hugely bolstered security force backed by Arab countries and maybe some other international backers to be able to take control and rule Gaza as Palestinian Authority ruled area as part of the West Bank as well. So the two territories are both under the same leadership, and there has to be a international force, hopefully places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar that will help rebuild Gaza. And then the final element is that for lasting peace, there really needs to be a more moderate Israeli government, not the current right wing extremist government, more moderate Israeli government that might be open to more long term concessions about Palestinian autonomy. That's what a good lasting peace will look like. We'll have to see if we get there.
Fair enough. And for the most part, we're kind of falling in similar lines. When I was having this conversation before with some other people, a couple of days ago, maybe even a week ago, something that obviously that was brought to the table that I do think that I brought up is obviously the Arab countries are going to have to play a role. Of course, Israel's going to completely take over. I don't think any of these countries are going to take part with Israel completely destroying Hamas. And one thing that I did not consider, which I did think was very interesting in the course of this conversation, was for some reason I completely did not think about the Palestinian Authority and their role in this and what they can provide as this kind of mediator between Israel and the Palestinian people. With that said, especially from your perspective, from being boots on the ground, from my understanding throughout history and general discourse that I hear here and there, the Palestinians wanted to be their own people. The Palestinians wanted individuality. Even though they wanted to get rid of Israel, they didn't even want to be occupied by Arab countries. They wanted to be Palestinian. They wanted to be an individual entity. A common theme said throughout Palestinians' conflict with Israel, of course. And as you mentioned just a little while ago, that the PA had problems with corruption, of course. And there's a reason why there's a lot of people who wanted to advocate for Hamas to take over because of that corruption that you mentioned. So if they completely lose and the PA and some of these Arab countries play a role in establishing a new kind of Palestinian state, what do you think will be the kind of what do you think the discourse will be from the Palestinian people on the ground in Gaza if this were to take place? Would they be not okay with it, but would they be understanding of it, or would they eventually go back and try to create a kind of uprising and intifada to establish now we want them all gone again? What do you think? What do
That's
you
a
think that the
huge
outlook
question.
will be?
I'm more hopeful than many people. A lot of people have said that look, all of everybody in Gaza is a terrorist, and it is true. And I've been interviewed some people who were attacked not by Hamas militants but by civilian Gazans who followed the militants into Israel and did some slaughtering themselves. I talked to victims of that slaughter, and so and we all saw the photos of Palestinians celebrating in Gaza as they paraded dead Jewish bodies through the streets, had brought back from the October 7th massacre. So there are certainly many civilians in Gaza who back Hamas, but I'm not one of those who believes that it's the majority. My feeling is maybe a third or so are kind of extremist jihadists there who back Hamas. But I talk to many people in Gaza who don't like Hamas, but they don't dare say it, or they'll be killed or vilified by Hamas, which still has power there. My feeling is there's probably a third of Hamas are jihadists. A third of them are very anti-Hamas, and a third of them just want to be left alone to live their lives. And I've found something out in this world, Riddell. I was also, as I mentioned, in Beirut during the civil war, the horrific civil war of the late 1980s between Christians and Muslims. I was alone on the Muslim side, alone meaning one of very few Westerners there. In fact, I was there with was almost kidnapped at one point, and I was there with a Western, a UK journalist named John McCarthy, who we had dinner one night, and the next day he was kidnapped. And it was a terrible time, but what I saw was some really lovely Muslim folks over there in Beirut. It's a beautiful country, and they whispered that they were terrified that this new force called Hezbollah was taking over. And what I learned is that both in a place like Hamas, where I spent time, and in Beirut, where I spent time during the war, I learned a sad truth about humanity and nations. And that truth is that if 10% of the people are extremists with guns, they could rule the other 90%. And that took place in Syria too, where Bashar Assad's extremism kept down the majority of the population. We see most of the people in Syria hated Assad, but he had the power because he had the guns. And so if you got 10%, you could take over. And that's what I saw. Uh, now, well, those, I think your question was whether or not Hamas could rise back up and whether the Palestinian people in Gaza in particular are just going to be prone to want to re embrace jihadism. I have hope. I have hope for that, and I have belief in the Palestinian people that I met. Many of them are very decent, welcoming souls. That if they have good leadership and an alternative that they could embrace, that there's hope. I don't think that the majority are jihadists. I think that they just felt that the Palestinian Authority was corrupt, so they take a chance in Hamas. But I think um, most people there now despise Hamas because they've. I'll tell you this. I'll tell you this, man. When you're in Gaza itself, which I was, and you see the dystopia, you see you see. This is what I saw. I was in this Israeli Jeep. I'm sorry, Israeli Humvee going through the war. This is what it looks like. This is the. You've all seen it on the news. That's the destruction in Hamas. Used to be a beautiful place, and it's now destroyed. And I will tell you that when you see the destruction up front, it hits you in the gut, man. It hits you right in the gut. First, did Israel really have to do this to much damage? The answer is kind of you tend toward yes, because Hamas is shooting at you from the buildings, and when the enemy's shooting from a building, you send a artillery shell into it. But the bigger question that comes up is, how is it possible? Hits you just deep in the gut. How is it possible if Hamas is the head of this place of Gaza of 2 million fellow Palestinians? How can they possibly allow their people to be continue to be slaughtered and their homeland destroyed? Why don't they have the power to let the hostages go tomorrow and lay down their arms and end the war tomorrow? They could end the war 1 hour from now. They just have to say, we're giving up the hostages and laying down our arms.
Yeah.
They don't care that their homeland's being destroyed. They don't care that their fellow people are being killed in the war by the tens of thousands. They even like that because it advances what they feel is they're winning the war of public opinion by parading civilian deaths. And so they've destroyed their homeland, and I think they're hated for it myself. It's just that you don't hear those voices right now because Hamas is still in enough power that people don't dare say it out loud. A few do, but most don't.
Yeah, it's quite crazy when people have this kind of outlook on thinking charitably of Hamas at any level at this point, understanding what Hamas has done, what is Hamas is willing to do at the end of the day. I think we need to recognize, and I think we need to accept as a whole, that this is a terrorist organization that needs to be taken out. And sometimes trying to understand from the outside point of view, war is impossible. You're not supposed to, especially if you live in peaceful countries. You're not supposed to understand how you're supposed to live in a peaceful life where all of this doesn't even cross your mind. So expecting people to understand this type of stuff is unrealistic. With that said, there's one more thing that I want to bring up. We're coming close to our end time that I do think is pretty interesting that I thought of, and that is the potential influence that the Arab side of Israel can provide. So what we do know, of course, is when Israel was establishing its state, and they had some, as they grew, at times they were able to bring in Arab individuals into the country, not just Jewish people, and even had them join the government. They were even voted into positions of power. Matter of fact, some of the Arab people of power were voting against returning certain lands to Palestine because they thought of them as a threat. What do you think about the influence of the Arab Israelis if Israel completely takes over Gaza, did everything they did? Do you think they can play a huge factor in establishing a kind of, not maybe a peace, but at the very least a bridge between Israel, the Jews, and the Palestinian Arabs in the country that are not jihadists and pro-Hamas, but are just still have this lingering kind of unease feeling regarding Israel. Do you think these Arab Israelis can be a huge factor into this equation?
It's a good question, and you bring up something that a lot of people overlook, especially the kids on campuses that say Israel's an apartheid state. There's a very big Arab Israeli population. Out of 10 million or so, 2 million are Arab, 10 million Israelis, 2 million are Arab Israelis, and they have full citizenship rights. There is an Arab Israeli that uh, is on the Supreme Court of the State of Israel. There are 8 or 9 Arab Israelis that are in Israel's Knesset, which is their parliament. There was an Arab Israeli woman that won Miss Israel. There's hundreds of thousands of doctors and other medical professionals that are Arab Israelis. And there are a number of Arab Israelis. They're not required to be in the military because there's a respect for their Arab background, but many of them volunteer. I was in the biggest hospital in the Middle East called Sheba Hospital, where hundreds of wounded IDF, Israeli Defense Force soldiers, are being treated. And among them, I talked to a Druze Arab, and who's a Israeli, and he was very much said, we have to have this fight to protect Israel because he sees himself as an Israeli. So to answer your question, it's a great question, but here's the nuance, Riddell. No, the answer is no, because I don't think even though the Arab Israelis feel conflicted, and some of them do certainly have a heart for the Palestinians, they really value their Israeli Arab citizenship, and I should just say their Israeli citizenship, and so. Let me give you an example of how interesting the situation is. At one point, we passed an Arab village, an Arab Israeli village that was on the right against the border of the West Bank. And a number of years ago, there was a part of one of the may have even been the Oslo Accords, a deal to swap a nearby Israeli settlement that was on the Palestinian side that was inside the West Bank, but on the border, to swap that land for this Arab Israeli community that was on the border on the Israeli side. So they just switched them. They'd say this Arab Israeli community on the Israel side will now be part of the West Bank, and the Jewish settlement on the West Bank side will now be part of Israel. You know who protested that? The Arab Israeli town. They didn't want to be part of the West Bank. They wanted to stay part of Israel. And you may have not seen this story, but it just broke in the last day or two. There was a vote among, you may have seen that Israeli troops have moved a little bit further into Syria after the fall of the dictatorship there to secure some border space. They moved into just a few miles into Syria to kind of protect against whatever may happen in Syria. Those few miles included some Druze villages. Druze are Arabs. Those Druze just took a vote, and that vote was that they very overwhelmingly, like unanimously said they want to be now part of Israel rather than part of Syria. And so there's a feeling that doesn't mean they don't have a heart for fellow Arabs in the Palestinian territories, but I think they very much identify as Israelis. And so I think the hope will be not so much for Arab Israelis to be part of a future peace, but for moderate forces, moderate folks in places like Gaza and especially the West Bank to try to come to more of a position of embracing a peace in the future with a more moderate Palestinian leadership rather than a Hamas-like Palestinian leadership. That's where the hope is going to be among moderate Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, more than from Arab Israelis somehow building a bridge with the Palestinians.
All right, fair enough. One more question. This is also something that is constantly brought up by the college students you're referencing. So I'm curious on your perspective. What do you think about the people who constantly bring up Israeli genocide and Israel occupying Gaza as a reason to basically side with Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me started on this. As I spent some time, spent a lot of time in the Palestinian territories. I spent a number of days there this time, and then in the past as well. And I certainly have a heart for Palestinians. But to say that Israel is guilty of genocide, let me just put it this way. When I was in Gaza in 1991, there were about 400,000 or 500,000 Palestinians that lived there. Now there are 2 million Palestinians that live there. If Israel is trying to commit genocide, they're really bad at it. They're really bad at it. And in terms of apartheid, as I just pointed out, there are 2 million Israeli Arab citizens with full rights. And so I just think the college campuses, campus kids, even those in the Ivies that you think would know better, are just spouting fashionable rhetoric. It's now fashionable to side with the oppressed Palestinians and against the oppressor Israelis. The Palestinians are oppressed, but I think they're oppressed by Hamas and to some extent by the Palestinian Authority, which is kind of corrupt. I think the cry of genocide in particular is really off base. It's terrible what's happened. 40,000 dead is terrible, but it's the Israelis do drop leaflets and make phone calls and say, you better leave this area now because you're about to be attacked. That's not how you do genocide. And, there are many examples of genocide in history, including the Holocaust itself. And the Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust or their families, they only wish that the kind of genocide people are claiming is happening in Gaza had happened to the Jews in Europe. In that case, there would have been only tens of thousands of Jews killed instead of 6 million. True genocide is an attempt to truly wipe out a people, and I think that word is being bandied about because it's freighted with emotional meaning and doesn't reflect the reality, which is that there's tragedy of war, but those victims are because, I saw it myself, man. I saw it myself. I went into the Hamas is hiding behind civilians. I went to a school there when I was in Hamas, and here's the school. Here's some Israeli soldiers I was with in Gaza. That school, 3 stories, 2 wings. They found it full of Hamas weaponry and Hamas soldiers. And my daughter's walking by. Ariel, you don't have to tiptoe. It's okay. They could handle it in the podcast. And it shows you that, as they said, as the Israeli soldiers said, we found the enemy and enemy weapons in every school, in every mosque, in every health facility. And, it's Hamas. And then I saw those destroyed homes. It was a beautiful neighborhood, but they were all destroyed because Hamas was hiding in the homes, shooting at the Israeli soldiers. And, the civilians' deaths are a result of Hamas hiding underneath and behind civilians. And yes, I won't deny that Israel sometimes does have disproportionate counterattacks. I won't deny that. And they'll probably say that in Lebanon too. But in terms of a concerted effort to actually create genocide, which is to kill as many civilians as possible, I was there, I saw it myself. That's just not true. That's false. But it is true that there are a tragically high number of civilians that have been killed. But I do blame Hamas. I saw it myself, how it was in these tunnels right underneath populated areas. I saw it myself. And they drew the fire against civilians. And I think deep down, Riddell, they wanted it. They wanted civilian deaths because that's helped them win the war of public opinion.
All right, fair enough. Ultimately, I think from this podcast episode, as people are listening, I think some of the things you should take away is understanding that this conflict's origin started out very complicated. Of course, it's not a simple thing you can go to in terms of not only the start of the conflict, but even trying to make an argument for people who had the rightful claim of the area that is Israel and Palestine. Ultimately, the resolutions and the agreements that have been trying to be made throughout time has been heavily affected by extremism on both sides, especially, of course, Palestine with the group of Hamas who wants to take over the entire of Israel, which is at this point impossible. You lost the conflict and you're just not going to get it back. But obviously, as we've said multiple times in today's podcast episodes, there definitely deserves blame and criticism of the far right-wing Israeli government as well. The people that are put in that government, the people who assassinated a leader who tried to advocate for peace, those criticisms are well-founded as well. So this conflict is complicated. This conflict is tough. But as of right now, what it seems like to me, and it seems to you as well, is that Israel is going to do whatever means possible to take out Hamas. And hopefully, with everything that has happened, a more moderate, a sense of peace is established with maybe the PA, maybe with a different type of government instilled in Palestine, and this conflict can be over. But that's hopeful thinking. We don't really know. Just know that this is not an easy thing to have an opinion on, ultimately. Anything? Oh, go
very
ahead.
complicated part of the world. But I will say this: the deck has been reshuffled with the collapse of the Syrian dictator, and the reason why it's been reshuffled is because it has hamstrung Iran. Iran created Hamas. Iran, which attacked Israel. Iran created Hezbollah in Lebanon, which attacked Israel in solidarity with Hamas. And now the fall of the dictator in Syria, which Iran also has supported. The fall of that dictator, the fall, the degrading of Hezbollah, the destruction of most of Hamas has kind of hamstrung Iran's ability. I think you got to really realize that all of this was really caused by Iran. Iran funded all these. Iran is the source of jihadism. I'd even say Iran. Israel is called a colonial state. Iran is the colonial state. They've colonized Syria. They colonized Gaza through Hamas. They colonized half of Lebanon through Hezbollah. And this collapse of Syria, the reason why it's relevant is that is now going to make it really hard for Iran to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. And if Hezbollah could be degraded in Lebanon, then Israel would have one more decent neighbor. Hezbollah is really a parasite on Lebanon. It's a beautiful country, and it was taken over by Hezbollah, supported by Iran. So hopefully these things could change. But man, the Middle East is 3D chess, Riddell. You don't know what's going to happen, and who knows what's going to happen in Syria. Maybe it'll be a good regime, and maybe it'll be like the Taliban coming to power in half of Syria, and the other half is going to be taken over by a new version of ISIS. So you don't know, but at the moment, it's your fingers are crossed that this could reshuffle the deck in a way with a little bit more hope for peace in the region. But let me put it this way: Israel lives in a bad neighborhood, so you just never know what the neighbors are going to do.
Very true. Very true. And hopefully people who are listening, of course, you can be empathetic towards the civilians of Palestine, the people who just don't want anything to do with this conflict. But at the same time, I think sometimes, especially on certain crowds, you're losing that sense of empathy you have for the Jewish people and the Israelis who obviously went through a lot throughout their history as well, and is surrounded by enemies too. So with that said, hope you guys enjoyed today's podcast episode. Do you have anything final to say? Do you want to plug your book again?
Well, I'm asking a author if he wants to plug his book is, like asking a teenager if they want to be home alone for the weekend so they could have a rager party. Of course, we want to plug our book. So I'll just say that, Amazon is on Amazon, but they're not letting me advertise it because they think the subject's too controversial, even though the book, The Holy Land at War, is balanced. And I can only say that, for an author, even if we got one new reader from your podcast to read it, that's what's meaningful to an author, that, you spend a long time putting yourself, in my case, in a lot of a dicey situation to be able to bring back some messages about an important part of the world. And it's a big mountain to climb. And, sure, being a bestseller would be nice, but books like this don't become bestsellers usually. What you hope for is maybe there'll be one reader out there that'll pick up your book and it will speak to them. And if that happens, that's where the heart of an author is touched.
All right, excellent. Again, the link will be in the description below. Hope you guys enjoyed today's podcast episode. If at any point you disagreed with anything that is said out there and you want to have a 1v1 conversation with me in my podcast episode, I don't run from the smoke, and I'm willing to have the conversation. So you feel free to hit me up via my email, of course. That will also be in the description. With that said, hope you guys enjoyed. Y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.